The envelope was cream-colored and heavy in her hand, and Claire Bennett knew before she opened it that something about it was wrong. Her name was written on the front in a handwriting she had not seen in 4 years, sharp and confident, the kind of handwriting that never doubted itself. She turned it over twice before she broke the seal, and when she read the words inside, her fingers went still. Edward Calloway was getting married. Not just married. He wanted her there. He wanted her to sit in the 3rd row and watch him promise his life to another woman, in the same church where he had once promised it to her, and then broken that promise without a single word of warning. She sat down slowly at her kitchen table, the invitation resting flat against the wood, and for a long moment she simply looked at it as if it might change into something else if she stared long enough. It did not change. The gold lettering still spelled out his name beside a name she did not recognize, Vanessa Whitfield, and beneath it, in smaller print, a request that felt more like a summons. Claire Bennett is cordially invited to witness the union of Edward Calloway and Vanessa Whitfield. She almost laughed. 4 years ago, Edward had looked her in the eye in that same kitchen and told her she was an embarrassment to his family, that she had never belonged in his world, that marrying her had been a mistake he intended to correct. He had walked out with 2 suitcases and a signature on divorce papers he had already prepared before he ever spoke to her about it. He had not looked back once. And now here he was, inviting her to watch him marry someone new, as if her presence were a formality, as if her heartbreak were something he could schedule between the flowers and the champagne toast. She understood immediately what this was. It was not an invitation. It was a performance, and she was meant to be the audience that proved how far he had risen and how small she had always been. He wanted her to see the venue, the money, the woman with the right last name, and he wanted her to feel every bit as discarded as she had felt the day he left. He wanted her to sit quietly and absorb the humiliation, because that was the kind of man Edward Calloway had become, or perhaps the kind of man he had always been and she had simply refused to see it. Her first instinct was to tear the invitation into pieces and drop it in the bin where it belonged. Her hand actually closed around the edge of the paper, ready to rip it apart. But something stopped her, a small, steady voice inside her that had grown louder over the last 4 years, the voice that had carried her through the nights she cried alone in a rented flat, with barely enough money for groceries, the voice that had pushed her to work 18-hour days when no one believed she would ever amount to anything without his name attached to hers. That voice did not tell her to hide. It told her to stand up straight and walk into that church exactly as she was. Claire set the invitation down and folded her hands together, staring out the window at the quiet street below. She thought of the woman she used to be, timid and apologetic, always shrinking herself to fit into rooms that were never built for her. She thought of the years since then, years no one in Edward's circle knew anything about, years spent building something from nothing, while everyone who once knew her assumed she had simply disappeared into obscurity, exactly where they believed she belonged. They had no idea what she had built, they had no idea who she had become, and that, she realized as she picked the invitation back up and studied the elegant script of the wedding date, was precisely the advantage she now held. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at the screen to see a message from her closest friend and business partner, Daniel Foss, asking if she had eaten dinner yet, completely unaware of what had just landed in her mailbox. She did not answer right away. Instead, she thought about how strange life could be, how a piece of paper could carry so much old pain and yet somehow feel less like a wound and more like an opportunity, sharp and glinting, waiting to be picked up. She thought about declining. It would have been the easier choice, the safer one, the one that avoided any risk of being hurt again by a man who had already hurt her more than anyone else in her life. She could write a polite note, wish him well, and go on with the quiet, successful existence she had carefully built for herself. No one would blame her for staying away. No one would even question it. But there was something inside her that refused to let the moment pass so easily. It was not desire for revenge, not exactly, though she would not have denied a flicker of satisfaction at the thought of him seeing her again and realizing he no longer had any power over how she felt. It was something steadier than that, something closer to certainty. She wanted to walk into that church not as the woman he had left behind, but as the woman she had become despite him, because of everything she had endured after him. She wanted him to look at her and understand, even if only for a moment, that discarding her had never made him stronger. It had simply removed him from her life, at the exact moment she was about to become someone he could never have imagined. She picked up her pen from the drawer beside the table, the same drawer where she kept the important documents from her company, papers that very few people had seen, papers that held far more weight than anyone attending that wedding could guess. She wrote her reply on a plain card, simple and polished, confirming that she would attend. As she sealed the envelope, she felt something settle inside her chest, a calm she had not expected. She was not walking into that church for him. She was walking in for herself, to close a door that had been left open far too long, to prove to no one but her own reflection that she had survived the very thing that was supposed to destroy her. Outside her window, the evening light stretched long and gold across the rooftops, and Claire Bennett sat for a while longer at her table, the sealed envelope in front of her, thinking not about the wedding at all, but about everything that had happened in the years since Edward Calloway walked out of her life. She thought about the first cold morning she woke up alone, about the job interviews where people looked at her with pity because they had heard whispers of the divorce, about the moment she had finally stopped waiting for anyone to rescue her and decided to rescue herself instead. She thought about how far that decision had taken her, and how little the people gathering for that wedding actually knew about the woman they had written off as a footnote in Edward Calloway's story. She placed the envelope by the door, ready to post in the morning, and turned off the kitchen light, leaving the room in a soft and steady darkness that no longer frightened her the way it once had. For the first time in a long while, Claire Bennett went to bed without dreading the days ahead. She went to bed already planning exactly how she would walk into that church, and exactly what she would wear, and exactly how calm her face would remain no matter what Edward Calloway said or did in front of his new bride, and every person who had once believed her life was over. She had no idea, not yet, just how much power she was about to carry into that room, or how quickly the wedding Edward had built to humiliate her would begin to unravel the moment she walked through the doors. In the weeks that followed, Claire went about her days as she always did, waking before sunrise to review reports, meeting with her small but fiercely loyal team, and speaking on calls with people who addressed her with a respect she had once thought she would never earn. None of them knew about the wedding, none of them knew about Edward Calloway at all, because she had built a firm rule for herself early on, one that had served her well through every hard year of rebuilding her life. She never spoke about her past unless it served a clear purpose. The people around her knew her only as capable, composed, and quietly formidable, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Still, some nights the memory crept back uninvited. She remembered the early days of her marriage, when Edward had been charming in a way that made her feel chosen, as though out of every woman he could have loved, he had picked her. She remembered how that charm had slowly curdled into something colder, how his family's opinions had started to matter more than her feelings, how every small correction about her clothing or her manners had chipped away at the woman she used to be, until there was almost nothing left of her but apology. She remembered the day he left with a clarity that still surprised her, not because it hurt, but because it no longer did. He had stood in the doorway with his coat already on, telling her that their marriage had simply run its course, that she would understand once she had time to think about it. She had not understood, not for a long time, but she understood something else now, something far more important. She understood that his leaving had not ended her story. It had only ended the version of her life that had been shaped entirely around him. As the wedding date drew closer, Claire found herself reviewing the invitation again, tracing her finger over the gold lettering, feeling nothing but a quiet, steady resolve. She was not the same woman who had once begged him to stay. She was someone new now, someone stronger, someone with resources and knowledge that no one in that church would expect her to hold. And whatever Edward Calloway believed he was inviting into his wedding, she intended to make certain it was not the broken woman he remembered. 4 years earlier, when Claire had first signed the divorce papers, she owned almost nothing. The apartment belonged to Edward's family. The car belonged to Edward's family. Even the small jewelry box on her dresser had been a gift chosen by his mother, meant to be returned the moment the marriage ended, and it was, without a single word of protest from Claire. She walked away with 2 suitcases of clothing, a modest savings account, and a stubborn refusal to ask anyone for help. She rented a small flat above a bakery on the edge of town, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the heating rattled through the night, and she took the first job she could find, answering phones for a logistics company that paid barely enough to cover rent. She remembered crying in that flat more nights than she could count, not because she missed Edward, but because she missed the version of herself who had once believed her life was going somewhere. It was during those quiet, difficult months that she met Daniel Foss, a soft-spoken analyst who worked 2 floors above her at the logistics company. He noticed something in her that no one else seemed to see, a sharpness in the way she solved problems, a natural instinct for spotting inefficiencies that saved the company money within weeks of her joining. He encouraged her to apply for a position in operations, then later helped her draft a business plan for a small consulting service the 2 of them began running on evenings and weekends, helping struggling companies streamline their supply chains. What started as a side project on borrowed time slowly became something much larger. Word spread quietly among business owners who appreciated results more than reputation, and within 2 years, Claire and Daniel's small consulting firm had grown into a respected name within the logistics and manufacturing industry, quietly securing contracts with companies that Edward's family would have recognized instantly, had they ever bothered to look. Claire never advertised her success. She never posted about it, never mentioned it at family gatherings she was no longer invited to, never once tried to prove anything to the people who had written her off. She simply worked, day after day, building something real, while the people who once knew her assumed she had faded into irrelevance. By the 3rd year, her firm had taken on a name of its own, separate from her identity as Edward Calloway's former wife, separate from any story that reduced her to a woman who had been left behind. She built relationships with suppliers, negotiated contracts with a confidence that surprised even her, and slowly became known in select circles as someone whose judgment could be trusted with decisions worth far more money than most people her age would ever touch in their lifetime. None of this reached Edward. He had moved in different circles entirely, spending his time at family dinners with the Whitfield family, the same family whose daughter he now intended to marry. Vanessa Whitfield came from old money and an old name, the kind of family whose approval Edward had always craved but never quite managed to earn on his own. Marrying into that family was, for Edward, a triumph long overdue, proof that he had finally arrived exactly where he believed he belonged. What Edward did not know, what none of the Whitfield family knew either, was that the very company preparing to host their extravagant wedding reception, a converted countryside estate recently purchased by an investment group looking to expand into luxury event spaces, had been financed and quietly controlled through a series of contracts that led directly back to Claire's firm. It was not a coincidence born of fate. It was simply the result of years spent building relationships and making sound decisions that others overlooked, one contract at a time, until her name sat quietly behind projects far larger than anyone assumed a woman with her history could manage. Daniel had been the one to notice it first, scrolling through a list of venue partnerships during a routine review of their portfolio. He had frozen when he saw the name of the estate, then the date, then finally the names attached to the booking. He had called Claire immediately, his voice tight with disbelief, asking her if she understood what this meant. She had gone quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before answering, her tone calm in a way that unsettled even him. She told him she understood exactly what it meant. It meant that Edward Calloway had unknowingly invited the one woman who could unravel his wedding with a single decision, and he had done it because he wanted to watch her suffer. In the days that followed, Claire kept the information close, sharing it with no one beyond Daniel, who agreed without hesitation to keep it quiet until she decided what to do with it. She did not rush toward any dramatic plan. She was not interested in scenes or spectacles. She simply continued preparing for the wedding as any invited guest would, choosing an outfit, arranging her schedule, and quietly reviewing the details of the contract that gave her more influence over that estate than the Whitfield family themselves realized. Meanwhile, across town, in a bright and expensive apartment overlooking the river, Vanessa Whitfield sat with her mother, reviewing final wedding details, laughing lightly about the guest list. When Claire's name came up on the seating chart, Vanessa rolled her eyes and remarked that she found it strange Edward had insisted on inviting his first wife at all, though she assumed it was simply his way of proving how far he had come since that unfortunate chapter of his life. Her mother agreed, adding with a small, dismissive smile that some people needed closure, even if it meant sitting through an evening of quiet humiliation. Neither of them had any idea that the woman they spoke of so carelessly held more power over their wedding than either of them could imagine, or that the very ground beneath their celebration was about to shift in ways no one at that table could yet foresee. Claire's rise had not come without cost. There had been nights when the consulting firm nearly collapsed under the weight of a single failed contract, when she and Daniel sat in a rented office with a space heater humming in the corner, wondering if they would be able to make payroll for their 2 employees at the time. There had been a winter when she skipped meals more often than she liked to admit, telling herself it was temporary, that better days were coming, even when she had no real evidence to support that belief beyond her own refusal to quit. She remembered one particular evening, almost 2 years after the divorce, when a former colleague of Edward's had recognized her at an industry mixer and made a comment meant to be friendly, but landed instead like a blade. He had said he was surprised to see her still working in the industry, as though he expected her to have vanished entirely once she lost access to Edward's name and connections. She had smiled politely that night and said very little, But she had gone home afterward and sat at her kitchen table for hours, let it fuel something inside her, rather than break her further. It was around that time she began making decisions that would define the next several years of her career. She stopped waiting for opportunities to come to her and started creating them herself, reaching out directly to companies she believed her firm could help, offering proposals before anyone asked for them, taking risks that more cautious business owners would have avoided. Some of those risks failed. Many of them did not. Slowly, contract by contract, her reputation began to shift from unknown newcomer to trusted advisor, the kind of person larger firms sought out quietly, without fanfare, because her results spoke clearly enough on their own. The investment group that eventually acquired the Countryside estate, the very venue now hosting Edward's wedding, had been one of her firm's earliest and most loyal clients. She had helped restructure their acquisition strategy years earlier, long before anyone connected to Edward's family had ever heard her name in a professional context. The relationship had grown over time into something built on genuine trust, the kind that gave her firm quiet but significant influence over decisions most guests attending events at that estate would never think twice about. Daniel often marveled at how little credit Claire took for any of it, how she preferred to work behind the scenes rather than seek recognition. He mentioned it to her more than once, half joking that she could easily have built a much louder reputation if she wanted one. She always answered the same way, telling him that loud reputations attracted attention she did not want, attention from people who might remember exactly who she used to be married to and start asking questions she had no interest in answering. That instinct for privacy was part of the reason no one on the Whitfield side of the wedding planning process had ever connected her name to the venue's ownership structure. Contracts were signed under her firm's registered name, a name entirely separate from anything tied to her marriage. She had built that separation deliberately, brick by brick, without ever imagining it would one day place her at the center of the very event designed to remind her of everything she had supposedly lost. As the wedding date drew closer, Claire allowed herself, for the first time in years, to sit with the full weight of what she had built. She thought about the woman she had been on her wedding day to Edward, nervous and eager to please, terrified of disappointing a family that had never truly accepted her. She thought about how different she felt now, walking into rooms full of powerful people without flinching, negotiating deals worth more than Edward's entire family fortune, answering to no one but herself. She did not feel triumphant exactly. It was quieter than that, steadier, something closer to peace. Whatever happened at that wedding, whatever Edward intended when he sent that invitation, she understood now that she was no longer the woman he could hurt. She had built something entirely her own, something strong enough to stand on its own foundation, untouched by his approval or his cruelty. Still, as she folded the final contract details into a drawer one evening and closed it quietly, she allowed herself one small private thought. She wondered what Edward's face would look like the moment he understood exactly who he had invited into his life again, and exactly how much power she now held over the very ground he planned to stand on when he said his vows. The morning of the wedding arrived with a soft golden light spreading across the Countryside estate, the kind of light that made the manicured gardens glow, and the white marquee shimmer against the green hills beyond it. Staff moved briskly across the lawns, arranging chairs in careful rows, adjusting flowers, testing the sound system for the string quartet that would play during the ceremony. Everything about the scene had been designed to look effortless, though anyone who understood the logistics behind it knew exactly how much planning and money had gone into making it appear that way. Claire arrived in a car she had hired for the occasion, choosing not to draw attention with anything flashy, though the simple elegance of her dress, a deep emerald green that suited her far better than anything she had worn during her marriage, caught more than a few glances as she stepped out and walked toward the entrance. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her makeup understated, her expression calm in a way that felt almost unnatural given the circumstances. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind over the past weeks, and now that it had finally arrived, she felt strangely steady, as though her body understood something her mind was only beginning to catch up to. She was greeted at the entrance by a young woman holding a clipboard, checking names against the guest list with polite efficiency. When Claire gave her name, the young woman paused for half a second longer than necessary, glancing up with a flicker of curiosity before quickly composing herself and gesturing toward the seating area. Word had clearly traveled among the staff and guests about who Claire was and why her presence at this particular wedding was considered unusual. She ignored the stares that followed her as she walked toward her assigned seat, holding her head high, refusing to let the whispers rattle the composure she had worked so hard to build. She found her seat in the third row, exactly where Edward had placed her, close enough to see everything, far enough to feel excluded from the immediate family and closest friends seated in the front. She recognized a few faces scattered among the crowd, old acquaintances from a life she had left behind, people who offered her tight, uncomfortable smiles before quickly looking away. She smiled back politely each time, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Near the front of the marquee, Edward stood speaking quietly with his best man, adjusting his cufflinks, glancing occasionally toward the entrance as guests continued to arrive. When his eyes finally landed on Claire, seated calmly among the other guests, something flickered across his face, a mixture of surprise and satisfaction, as though her presence confirmed exactly what he had hoped to see. He had expected her to look smaller somehow, worn down by the years, perhaps even desperate in the way she carried herself. Instead, he found himself staring at a woman who looked more composed and more confident than he remembered her ever being during their marriage. He excused himself from his best man and walked toward her, weaving through clusters of guests with a practiced smile plastered across his face, the same smile he had once used to charm her family into believing he was the perfect match for their daughter. He stopped in front of her chair, looking down with an expression that barely concealed his satisfaction. He greeted her warmly, his voice carrying just enough volume for nearby guests to hear, remarking on how kind it was of her to come, how much it meant to him that she could witness this new chapter of his life. Claire looked up at him steadily, her expression unreadable, and thanked him for the invitation, her tone polite and even, giving him nothing to work with, no flicker of pain or bitterness for him to savor. He seemed thrown for a moment by her calm, though he recovered quickly, leaning slightly closer and lowering his voice just enough to make his next words feel private, though clearly intended for anyone nearby to overhear. He told her it must be strange for her, watching him marry someone from a family as respected as the Whitfields, especially after everything that had happened between them. He said it with a smile, as though the words were kind, though the intention behind them was unmistakable. Claire held his gaze without blinking, her voice steady, as she replied that she was simply happy to be there, and that she wished him and Vanessa every happiness. Something in her calm unsettled him more than any angry response could have. He studied her face for a moment longer, searching for some crack in her composure, some sign that his words had landed the way he intended. He found nothing, and after a brief, awkward pause, he excused himself and returned to the front of the marquee, his confidence slightly less certain than it had been moments before. Not far from where Claire sat, Vanessa's mother, Margaret Whitfield, stood speaking with the estate's event coordinator, reviewing final details before the ceremony began. She was a sharp, poised woman who had spent decades cultivating relationships within the upper circles of business and society, and she prided herself on knowing exactly who controlled what within any room she entered. As she glanced toward the seating area, her eyes landed briefly on Claire, and something about the woman's presence caught her attention in a way she could not immediately explain. She turned to the event coordinator and asked, almost offhandedly, whether that guest sitting quietly in the third row was familiar to the estate staff. The coordinator, caught slightly off guard by the question, admitted that the name on the guest list matched the name attached to several documents related to the estate's recent ownership restructuring, though she had not yet had time to confirm the connection given the busy schedule of the day. Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of unease passing behind her otherwise composed features. She excused herself and moved toward a quiet corner near the edge of the marquee, pulling out her phone to send a quick message to the family's financial advisor, someone she trusted to clarify any confusion quickly and quietly before the ceremony began. She did not want to disrupt the day with unnecessary concern, but something about the coincidence of names felt too significant to ignore entirely. Meanwhile, guests continued arriving, filling the rows with soft chatter and the occasional burst of laughter, the string quartet beginning to play a gentle melody that drifted across the lawns. Vanessa remained inside the estate's private preparation room, surrounded by bridesmaids fussing over the final adjustments to her gown, unaware of the quiet tension beginning to build outside among the family members responsible for ensuring the day unfolded exactly as planned. Claire sat quietly through the growing commotion, watching everything unfold with a calm patience that surprised even her. She could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way certain guests glanced toward her with newfound curiosity, the way Margaret Whitfield's earlier composure had cracked ever so slightly before she disappeared toward the edge of the marquee. She said nothing, gave nothing away, simply continued to sit with her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting for the ceremony to begin. She had not come to make a scene. She had not come with any plan beyond simply attending, holding her head high, and refusing to let Edward see even a flicker of the pain he had once caused her. But as she watched Margaret's hurried exit and noticed the tension building among the estate staff, She began to understand that something larger than her own quiet dignity was beginning to unfold, something she had not fully anticipated when she accepted the invitation weeks earlier. The event coordinator, now visibly anxious, approached the estate's senior manager near the entrance, speaking in hushed tones about a discrepancy in the ownership documentation that had surfaced during a routine check earlier that morning. The senior manager frowned, glancing toward the seating area before excusing himself to make a phone call, his expression tightening as he listened to whoever answered on the other end. Claire remained unaware of the exact details unfolding behind the scenes, though she could sense, with the same instinct that had guided her through years of careful business decisions, that the calm surface of the day was beginning to shift beneath everyone's feet. She glanced toward the front of the marquee, where Edward stood once again with his best man, laughing at some remark, entirely oblivious to the quiet unraveling taking place just beyond his line of sight. The music shifted, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin, and the murmur of the crowd softened into an expectant hush. Claire straightened slightly in her seat, watching the entrance where Vanessa would soon appear, her heart steady despite the strange undercurrent of tension she could feel building around her. Whatever was about to happen, she understood instinctively that the day was no longer unfolding exactly as Edward had planned it, and for reasons she did not yet fully understand herself, she found herself watching the scene with a quiet, careful attention, ready for whatever came next. Behind the marquee, in a small office tucked into the side of the old estate house, the senior manager stood with the phone pressed tightly against his ear, his voice low and clipped as he spoke with someone from the legal department of the investment group that technically controlled the property. He asked, again, for confirmation of exactly whose signature carried final authority over any event held on the grounds, particularly regarding liability, insurance, and the right to approve or halt proceedings if certain contractual conditions were not met. The voice on the other end read him a name he had seen 100 times on paperwork over the past year, but had never once connected to a real, living person standing on the property itself: Claire Bennett. He thanked the caller and ended the call slowly, staring at the receiver for a long moment before stepping back out into the hallway. He had worked events at the estate for nearly 3 years, and in all that time, he had never once needed to think twice about the name behind the ownership structure, because it had never mattered before. Weddings came and went, each one blending into the last, each contract signed and filed without much thought given to the individuals attached to them. But standing there now, with Margaret Whitfield's earlier question echoing in his mind, he understood that today was different in a way he had not anticipated when he arrived that morning. He found Margaret near the edge of the marquee, speaking quietly with the family's financial advisor, a stern-looking man in his 60s who had clearly rushed over the moment he received her message. The manager approached carefully, keeping his voice low as he relayed what he had just learned, watching Margaret's expression shift from mild curiosity to something closer to alarm as the pieces began falling into place. She turned toward the seating area again, her eyes finding Claire almost instantly among the rows of guests, and for the first time that day, her composed exterior wavered visibly. She excused herself from the conversation and walked briskly toward the front of the marquee, searching for Edward among the small cluster of groomsmen adjusting their jackets and exchanging quiet jokes to calm their nerves before the ceremony. She pulled him aside without explanation, her grip firm on his arm, and asked him quietly whether he had any idea that his first wife held a controlling interest in the very venue hosting his wedding. Edward blinked at her, momentarily confused, certain he had misheard. He asked her to repeat herself, and when she did, slower this time, emphasizing each word, he felt something cold settle in his stomach. He glanced toward the seating area, toward Claire sitting calmly among the guests, and for the first time since sending that invitation weeks earlier, doubt crept into his expression. He had spent so much time imagining this day as his moment of quiet triumph over her that the idea of her holding any kind of power over the proceedings had simply never occurred to him. He tried to reassure Margaret, insisting there had to be some mistake, that Claire had no connections to anything of that scale, that she had barely managed to support herself after their divorce, let alone acquire influence over a property worth what this estate was worth. Margaret's expression remained skeptical, and she reminded him sharply that their financial advisor did not make mistakes of this nature, particularly not when it came to matters directly affecting the Whitfield family's reputation and investment. Edward excused himself from the conversation, his earlier confidence rapidly draining away as he made his way toward the small office where the senior manager had taken the earlier phone call. He asked to see the documentation himself, his voice tighter than he intended, his hands slightly unsteady, as he flipped through the paperwork the manager presented to him. There, buried among clauses about insurance liability and event approval rights, was Claire's name, listed clearly as a principal decision-maker for any event held on the property exceeding a certain financial threshold, a threshold his wedding, with its scale and cost, comfortably exceeded. He stood in that small office for a long moment, staring at the paperwork, feeling the ground shift beneath him in a way he had never anticipated. He thought back to the moment he had decided to send her that invitation, remembering how satisfied he had felt imagining her humiliation, how certain he had been that she would arrive small and broken, easy to dismiss with a few carefully chosen words. He had not imagined this. He had not imagined that the very woman he set out to humiliate might, in some strange twist of circumstance, hold more control over his wedding day than he did himself. Outside, the string quartet continued playing, the guests remaining largely unaware of the tension building behind the scenes. Vanessa, still in the preparation room, remained blissfully unaware as well, laughing softly with her bridesmaids as they adjusted the final details of her veil, entirely unprepared for the storm quietly gathering just beyond the walls of that room. Claire, still seated calmly in the third row, noticed Edward's absence from the front of the marquee and felt a flicker of quiet curiosity, though she gave no outward sign of concern. She had not orchestrated any of this. She had simply accepted an invitation and arrived, calm and composed, allowing the truth of her own life to speak for itself without any need for dramatic confrontation. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, she understood she had not caused it directly. She had simply, through years of quiet, determined work, built something so substantial that it could no longer remain hidden once circumstances brought it into the light. She glanced toward the entrance, where guests continued arriving, adjusting their seats, checking their phones, entirely unaware of the quiet crisis unfolding just out of view. She thought, briefly, of how strange it was that the very day designed to remind her of everything she had lost had instead become the moment where everything she had built finally revealed itself, not through any effort of her own, but simply because the truth had a way of surfacing exactly when it needed to. Somewhere behind the marquee, Edward finally set the paperwork down and pressed his palms flat against the desk, trying to steady his breathing before he had to return to his guests and pretend nothing was wrong. He understood now that the calm, composed woman sitting quietly in the third row was not the same person he had left 4 years earlier, and he understood, with a sinking certainty, that whatever happened next would depend entirely on how she chose to use the power she now held. He splashed cold water on his face in the small washroom attached to the office, staring at his reflection for a long moment, trying to summon the confidence that had carried him through every important moment of his adult life. It did not come easily. He thought about walking straight to Claire and demanding an explanation, but some instinct told him that approach would only make him look weaker in front of the very people he most wanted to impress. He thought about ignoring the situation entirely, proceeding with the ceremony as planned and hoping the details would sort themselves out later. But the memory of Margaret's sharp, alarmed expression told him that option was no longer realistic either. His best man knocked on the office door, reminding him gently that the ceremony was due to begin in a matter of minutes, that guests were growing restless, that Vanessa was ready and waiting. Edward straightened his jacket, took a slow breath, and forced his expression back into something resembling composure, though the calm no longer reached his eyes. He walked back out toward the marquee, nodding at guests who greeted him warmly, entirely unaware of the quiet turmoil hidden just beneath his polished exterior. As he took his place at the front of the marquee, he allowed himself one brief glance toward the third row, toward Claire, who met his gaze with the same steady, unreadable calm she had carried since the moment she arrived. For the first time in years, Edward Calloway felt something he had not expected to feel toward her again. Not pity, not nostalgia, but something closer to fear, a quiet, creeping recognition that the woman he had once dismissed so easily now held the power to change the course of his life with a single decision, and he had absolutely no way of knowing what she intended to do with it. The music shifted again, softer now, signaling the start of the processional, and Vanessa appeared at the entrance of the marquee, radiant in a gown of ivory silk, her father beside her, beaming with pride as the guests rose to their feet. Claire stood along with everyone else, watching the bride walk slowly down the aisle, feeling none of the bitterness she might have expected to feel in this moment. She felt only a strange, distant curiosity about how the day would unfold now that the truth had clearly begun to surface among the wedding party. Vanessa reached the front of the marquee and took her place beside Edward, smiling brightly, entirely unaware of the tension radiating from her mother and the wedding coordinators standing nearby. The officiant began the ceremony with the usual warm opening remarks, welcoming the guests, speaking about love and commitment, while Margaret Whitfield stood rigid near the front row, her eyes flicking repeatedly toward the seating area where Claire remained calm and composed. Partway through the officiant's opening words, the estate's senior manager appeared quietly at the edge of the marquee, catching Margaret's attention with a subtle gesture. She excused herself as discreetly as possible, stepping just outside the tent to speak with him, her expression tightening further as he relayed additional details he had uncovered during a hurried review of the contract. It was not simply that Claire held decision-making authority over events at the estate. It was that a specific clause, buried deep within the property's original financing agreement, gave her firm the right to halt any event immediately if concerns arose regarding the legitimacy or reputation of the parties involved. A clause originally included to protect the investment group from any scandal that might damage the estate's standing among future clients. Margaret's mind raced as she processed the implications. The Whitfield family's reputation depended heavily on this wedding proceeding smoothly, not only because of the social prestige attached to a union with the Calloway family, but because a significant business partnership between the two families had been quietly negotiated to finalize immediately following the wedding, a partnership that depended entirely on both families presenting a united, respectable front to their shared business associates. If Claire chose to invoke that clause, if she chose to raise any concern publicly or privately regarding the legitimacy of the event, the entire arrangement could unravel within hours, taking with it years of careful negotiation and an enormous amount of money already committed to the partnership. She returned to her seat with a forced smile, her mind working quickly behind her composed expression, trying to determine the safest way to approach the situation without drawing unwanted attention from the gathered guests. She caught Edward's eye briefly during a pause in the ceremony and gave the faintest shake of her head, a silent warning that something serious was unfolding, though there was little either of them could do in the middle of the vows without creating a far larger scene than either wanted. The ceremony continued, though the atmosphere among the immediate family had shifted noticeably, a tension threading through their smiles that only those closest to the situation could detect. Vanessa, still unaware, recited her vows with genuine emotion, her voice steady and warm, as she spoke about the future she envisioned with Edward. He responded in kind, though his voice carried a slight unevenness that he hoped no one else would notice, his mind only half present in the moment, the rest consumed with calculating how to navigate the crisis quietly building around him. As the officiant moved toward the exchange of rings, a soft commotion began near the back of the marquee. The senior manager had returned, this time accompanied by a well-dressed man Claire recognized immediately, one of the investment group's senior partners, a man named Nathaniel Hargrove, who had flown in earlier that week for an unrelated business matter and had been alerted to the unfolding situation by the estate's legal team. He approached quietly, careful not to interrupt the ceremony directly, but his presence alone signaled to Margaret and Edward that this matter had grown far beyond a simple administrative confusion. Nathaniel made his way toward the seating area and took a seat beside Claire, leaning in to speak with her in hushed tones, careful not to disturb the ceremony further. He explained that the legal team had flagged an urgent concern regarding certain undisclosed financial obligations tied to the Whitfield family's recent business dealings, obligations that, if left unresolved, could expose the estate and its partners to significant liability, particularly given the scale and visibility of today's event. He asked respectfully whether Claire, given her authority within the firm, wished to address the matter now or allow the ceremony to conclude before any formal discussion took place. Claire considered the question carefully, watching Edward and Vanessa complete the exchange of rings at the front of the marquee, their hands trembling slightly, though for entirely different reasons. She thought about the woman she used to be, the one who might have used a moment like this to unleash years of pent-up anger, to make a scene loud enough that no one in that marquee would ever forget it. She was not that woman anymore. She had built her success on patience, precision, and calm judgment, not on spectacle, and she intended to handle this situation the same way she handled every difficult decision in her professional life. She told Nathaniel quietly that she saw no reason to interrupt the ceremony itself, that whatever concerns needed addressing could wait until a more appropriate moment, away from the eyes of guests who had come simply to celebrate two people they cared about. Nathaniel nodded, clearly relieved by her measured response, and thanked her for her discretion before rising quietly and stepping back toward the edge of the marquee to relay her decision to the waiting legal team. Margaret, watching this exchange from across the aisle, felt a small measure of relief wash over her, though it was quickly replaced by a deeper unease. She understood now, with growing clarity, that the woman she had dismissed so easily weeks earlier as an unfortunate footnote in Edward's past held more restraint and more power than she had ever imagined. It was not comforting. It was, in some strange way, far more unsettling than if Claire had simply stood up and caused a scene, because restraint of this kind suggested someone who acted with intention, someone who would choose exactly the right moment to reveal what she knew, rather than acting impulsively out of anger. The ceremony concluded with the officiant pronouncing Edward and Vanessa husband and wife, and the Marquis erupted into polite applause as the newlyweds turned to face their guests, Vanessa beaming with joy, Edward's smile noticeably strained beneath the surface. As the guests began rising from their seats, moving toward the reception area for photographs and champagne, Margaret quickly intercepted Edward before he could be swept away by well-wishers, gripping his arm tightly and telling him, in a low, urgent voice, that they needed to speak with Claire immediately, privately, before the situation grew any more complicated. Edward glanced toward Claire, who remained seated calmly amid the departing guests, watching the scene unfold with the same steady composure she had carried throughout the entire ceremony. He felt a fresh wave of unease settle over him, understanding that whatever conversation was about to take place would determine far more than his pride. It would determine the future of his marriage, his family's business interests, and quite possibly his entire reputation among the people whose respect he had worked his whole life to earn. He excused himself from a cluster of relatives offering congratulations and made his way toward Claire, Margaret following closely behind him, both of them wearing carefully composed expressions that did little to hide the tension simmering beneath the surface. Claire rose from her seat as they approached, meeting their gazes with the same calm, unreadable expression she had maintained since the moment she arrived, giving neither of them any indication of what she intended to say next. Around them, the reception was beginning to take shape, waiters moving through the crowd with trays of champagne, a photographer gathering the wedding party for formal portraits near the garden fountain, laughter and conversation rising steadily as guests settled into the celebration. None of them seemed to notice the small, tense cluster standing near the edge of the emptying marquee, or if they did, they assumed it was simply a warm exchange between family and an old acquaintance, nothing worth a second glance. Margaret spoke first, her voice carefully controlled, though the strain beneath it was unmistakable. She thanked Claire for attending, then, without much preamble, asked whether they might find a quieter place to speak, somewhere away from the crowd, to discuss a matter of some importance regarding the estate and its ownership structure. Claire studied her for a moment, noting the careful phrasing, the way Margaret avoided naming the issue directly even now, clearly hoping to keep the conversation as contained and controlled as possible. Claire agreed, her tone even, and suggested the small study near the east wing of the estate house, a quiet room she had noticed earlier when she arrived, tucked away from the noise of the reception. Edward said nothing, simply nodding stiffly, his jaw tight as the three of them made their way across the lawn, weaving carefully around clusters of celebrating guests who called out congratulations to Edward as he passed, unaware of the storm gathering behind his forced smile. Inside the study, the noise of the reception faded to a distant hum, the tall windows overlooking the gardens filtering in soft afternoon light. Claire took a seat near the window, unhurried, while Edward and Margaret remained standing, their postures rigid, their expressions caught somewhere between anger and desperation. For a long moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching heavy and uncomfortable between them. Finally, Edward broke it, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the confident charm he had carried earlier in the day. He asked her directly whether it was true, whether she truly held the kind of authority over the estate that Margaret had described. Claire met his eyes steadily and confirmed it without hesitation, explaining plainly that her firm had been involved with the investment group's portfolio for several years, long before she had any knowledge that this particular property would ever be connected to him. She watched the information land, watched Edward's expression shift from disbelief to something closer to quiet dread as the reality settled fully over him. He had spent weeks imagining this day as his moment of triumph, a chance to prove to Claire and to himself just how far he had risen since their divorce. Instead, he now stood in a borrowed study, asking his former wife whether she intended to use her position to unravel everything he had built. Margaret, sensing the direction of the conversation slipping further from her control, stepped forward and addressed Claire directly, her tone shifting from cautious diplomacy to something closer to urgency. She explained, with visible reluctance, that a significant business partnership between the Whitfield and Calloway families depended on today's event proceeding without incident. A partnership worth a substantial sum of money and years of careful negotiation. She asked Claire, plainly, what it would take to ensure that whatever concerns had been raised by the legal team could be resolved quietly, without further disruption to the day or damage to either family's reputation. Claire listened patiently, her expression giving away nothing, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make both of them visibly uncomfortable, before she finally spoke. She told them she had not come to that wedding with any intention of causing trouble, that she had simply accepted an invitation extended to her weeks earlier, an invitation she now understood had been sent with far less generous intentions than either of them wished to admit. She said it evenly, without accusation, though the weight of the statement was unmistakable, and she watched Edward's face flush slightly, as the memory of his true motivations settled uncomfortably between them. Edward opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, unable to find words that would not sound hollow given everything that had just been laid bare between them. He looked away toward the window, toward the gardens where guests continued laughing and celebrating, entirely unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place just inside the study walls. He thought of the speech he had rehearsed weeks earlier in his mind, the one where he pictured Claire sitting small and humiliated while he stood tall beside his new bride, surrounded by everything he believed proved his success. That speech felt foolish to him now, a fantasy built on assumptions he had never bothered to question. Margaret, less concerned with pride and more concerned with the practical consequences unfolding before her, pressed forward, asking again, more directly this time, what Claire intended to do. She reminded her that the partnership between the families involved not only significant financial commitments, but the livelihoods of employees across both companies, people who had no part in whatever personal history existed between Claire and Edward, and who stood to lose a great deal if the arrangement collapsed over a matter that, in her eyes, had nothing to do with business at all. Claire rose slowly from her seat by the window, taking a moment to smooth the fabric of her dress before she spoke again, her voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that neither Edward nor Margaret had expected from her. She told them that she understood the stakes involved, that she had spent years building a career precisely because she understood the weight of decisions like this one, the way they rippled outward to touch lives far beyond the people making them. She said she had no interest in destroying anyone's livelihood out of spite, that such an act would say more about her own character than it would about theirs. But, she continued, her tone sharpening slightly, she also had no interest in pretending the events of the day, or the years before it, had not happened. She reminded Edward, plainly and without raised voice, of the exact words he had used the day he left her, the accusations about her not belonging in his world, the casual cruelty he had shown without a hint of remorse. She reminded him that he had invited her to this wedding specifically to relive that cruelty, to watch her sit quietly while he built a new life on top of the ashes of the one he had abandoned her in. Edward's face had gone pale by the time she finished speaking, the confidence he wore like armor completely stripped away in the quiet study. He tried to argue that he had not intended it the way she described, that perhaps his motivations had been more complicated than pure cruelty, but his words lacked conviction even to his own ears, and Claire's steady, unflinching gaze made it clear she saw straight through the excuse before he finished making it. Margaret, watching the exchange with growing unease, attempted to steer the conversation back toward practical matters, reminding Claire once more of the financial stakes involved, offering, almost desperately, to discuss any compensation or arrangement that might satisfy her, and allow the partnership to proceed without further complication. Claire turned to her and studied her for a long moment, recognizing in Margaret's offer the same instinct that had shaped so much of Edward's family's behavior toward her years earlier, the assumption that every problem could be solved with money, that dignity and respect were simply commodities to be purchased when convenient. She told Margaret plainly that she had no interest in compensation of any kind, that the offer itself revealed exactly the kind of thinking that had made her feel so small and disposable during her marriage to Edward. She was not there to extract money from either of them. She was there because she had been invited, and because she had decided, months ago in her own kitchen, that she would no longer allow herself to shrink away from rooms simply because someone else believed she did not belong in them. The study fell silent again, the weight of her words settling heavily over all three of them. Outside, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted faintly through the window, a stark contrast to the tense stillness inside the room. Edward finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, stripped of any remaining pretense, asking her directly what she intended to do about the estate, about the clause that gave her the authority to disrupt the partnership if she chose to. Claire considered the question carefully, taking a slow breath before she answered. She told him that she had never intended, from the very moment she accepted his invitation, to sabotage his wedding or destroy his family's business dealings. Her goal had never been revenge in the way he clearly feared it might be. She had simply wanted to walk into that church, or in this case that marquee, and prove to herself, if to no one else, that she had survived everything he put her through and built something entirely her own in the process. She paused, glancing between the two of them, watching the tension in their expressions shift slightly toward cautious relief. Though she was not finished speaking, she told them that while she had no intention of destroying the partnership out of malice, she also would not simply allow the matter to disappear as though nothing had happened. She informed them that she intended to formally document the events of the day, not to expose them publicly or create a scandal, but to ensure there was a clear record establishing exactly how the situation had unfolded, protecting her firm's reputation and her own integrity from any future attempt by either family to distort the story to their advantage. She also made clear, her voice firm and unwavering, that she expected a formal, written acknowledgement from Edward's family regarding the way she had been treated both during her marriage and in the lead-up to this wedding, an acknowledgement that would remain private, shared with no one beyond the immediate parties involved, but that would exist as a matter of record, a small but meaningful correction to years of being dismissed and diminished without consequence. Margaret, though visibly uncomfortable, agreed almost immediately, understanding that this was a far more reasonable outcome than she had feared when she first learned of Claire's connection to the estate. Edward remained silent for a long moment, staring at the floor, before finally nodding as well, his voice barely above a whisper as he agreed to her terms. Claire studied him for a moment longer, searching his face for any trace of the man she had once loved, the man who had promised to build a life with her before deciding she was not worth the effort of keeping that promise. She found only a tired, chastened version of the confident groom who had greeted her earlier that day, a man finally forced to reckon, if only briefly, with the consequences of his own choices. She told them both, calmly and without any trace of triumph in her voice, that the partnership could proceed as planned, that she had no interest in punishing employees or business partners who had nothing to do with the personal history between her and Edward. She simply wanted, finally, to be seen clearly by the people who had once decided she did not matter, and to walk away from that room knowing she had stood her ground without losing herself in the process. As she turned to leave the study, Edward called out to her once more, his voice hesitant, asking whether she had truly come to the wedding today with no intention of hurting him. She paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression that held no anger, only a quiet, hard-won peace. She told him she had not come to hurt him. She had come to prove, to herself more than anyone else, that she no longer needed his approval, his family's respect, or his apology, to know exactly who she was, and everything she had built without him. And with that, she walked out of the study, leaving both Edward and Margaret standing in stunned silence, the weight of everything that had just happened settling slowly over the quiet room behind her. As Claire stepped back out into the corridor, she found Nathaniel Hargrove waiting near the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, though she could tell from the slight tilt of his head that he had likely overheard at least part of the conversation through the heavy wooden door. He fell into step beside her as she walked toward the gardens, asking quietly whether the matter had been resolved to her satisfaction. She told him it had, that the partnership could proceed without any further complications from her end, and that she would follow up formally with the necessary documentation once she returned to her office the following week. Nathaniel nodded, clearly relieved, though he lingered for a moment longer, studying her with a curious expression. He remarked, almost carefully, that he had worked with her firm for several years now, and had always respected her judgment, but that watching her navigate this particular situation had given him an even deeper appreciation for the kind of restraint and integrity she brought to difficult decisions. Claire thanked him quietly, though she did not linger on the compliment, her mind already turning toward the reception unfolding across the lawn, toward the strange, complicated feeling of walking back into a celebration for a marriage that had once been meant to replace her. She made her way slowly across the gardens, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses growing louder as she approached the reception area. Guests mingled beneath strings of soft lights just beginning to glow against the fading daylight, and she found herself pausing near the edge of the garden, watching the celebration from a small distance, feeling neither the bitterness she once feared she might feel, nor any particular desire to join the festivities. It was there, near a cluster of rose bushes at the garden's edge, that Vanessa found her. The new bride had slipped away from the crowd for a brief moment of quiet, still glowing with the joy of the day, though her expression shifted slightly with curiosity as she noticed Claire standing alone. She approached cautiously, introducing herself with a warmth that felt entirely genuine, unaware of everything that had just transpired inside the study only minutes earlier. Vanessa admitted, with a small embarrassed laugh, that she had wondered about Claire ever since she saw her name on the guest list, curious about the woman who had once been married to the man she now called her husband. She asked, gently, whether it had been difficult for Claire to attend, her tone carrying genuine concern, rather than the careless dismissiveness her mother had shown earlier that week. Claire studied her for a moment, recognizing something familiar in the young woman's open, earnest expression. Something that reminded her faintly of who she herself had been many years earlier, before disappointment had taught her to guard herself more carefully. She told Vanessa honestly that the day had been difficult in ways she had not fully anticipated, though not for the reasons Vanessa likely assumed. She chose her words carefully, unwilling to burden the young bride with the full weight of everything that had unfolded behind the scenes, but she allowed herself a small measure of honesty, telling Vanessa that marriage required more than charm and comfortable circumstances, that it required a partner who saw you clearly and valued you consistently, not only when it was convenient. Vanessa listened thoughtfully, something flickering behind her eyes that suggested she understood more than she let on, perhaps sensing already, in ways she had not yet fully articulated even to herself, that her new husband's confidence sometimes came at the expense of others. She thanked Claire quietly for her honesty, and for a brief moment, the two women stood together in comfortable silence, an unspoken understanding passing between them that needed no further explanation. Before returning to the reception, Vanessa asked one more question, hesitant but sincere, wondering aloud whether Claire had any regrets about the years she had spent married to Edward. Claire considered the question carefully before answering, telling her that she regretted the pain of those years, certainly, but she did not regret who she had become because of them. She told Vanessa that sometimes the hardest chapters of a person's life turned out to be the ones that taught them the most about their own strength, and that she hoped, sincerely, that Vanessa's marriage would never require her to learn that particular lesson the way Claire had been forced to learn it. Vanessa nodded slowly, clearly moved by the exchange, and after a brief, warm goodbye, made her way back toward the reception, leaving Claire alone once more among the rose bushes, the golden evening light settling softly around her. She stood there for a long while, watching the celebration continue in the distance, feeling a quiet, unexpected sense of closure settle over her, different from anything she had anticipated when she first received that invitation weeks earlier. Meanwhile, back inside the study, Edward remained seated at the edge of the desk, staring blankly at the wall, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly draining away and leaving behind a heavy, uncomfortable exhaustion. Margaret watched him for a moment before speaking again, her tone softer now, though still edged with the practical concerns of a woman who had spent her life protecting her family's interests above almost everything else. She reminded him that the partnership was safe, that the day could still be salvaged, that all he needed to do now was return to the reception and play the part of the happy groom for the remainder of the evening. Edward nodded slowly, though his mind remained elsewhere, replaying the conversation with Claire over and over, searching for some way to reconcile the version of himself he had always believed himself to be, with the version she had just described so plainly and so accurately. He thought about the early years of their marriage, the small cruelties he had allowed himself to justify at the time, the way he had slowly convinced himself that her unhappiness was a flaw in her character, rather than a consequence of his own behavior. He had never truly examined those years until this moment, standing in the wreckage of his own carefully constructed pride. He rose eventually, straightening his jacket, and made his way back toward the reception, forcing a smile onto his face as he rejoined the celebration, greeting guests and accepting congratulations with a hollow warmth that few people noticed, though Vanessa, watching him from across the garden, felt a small, uneasy flicker of doubt she could not yet fully explain, even to herself. As the evening wore on, the reception continued much as any wedding celebration might, with toasts and dancing and the soft glow of string lights illuminating the gardens as darkness settled over the estate. Claire remained only a short while longer, declining a plate of food offered by a passing waiter, choosing instead to slip quietly toward the entrance where her hired car waited to take her home. She did not seek out Edward again, did not linger for any final confrontation or dramatic exit. She simply left, the same way she had arrived, calm and composed, carrying with her the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had finally closed a chapter of her life on her own terms, rather than the terms someone else had once tried to impose upon her. The days following the wedding passed quietly for Claire, though she noticed a subtle shift in herself that she had not fully expected. She returned to her office on Monday morning with the same steady focus she always brought to her work, reviewing contracts, meeting with clients, guiding her small but growing team through the usual rhythm of business decisions. Daniel noticed the change immediately, though it took him a few days to name it precisely. She seemed lighter somehow, as though a weight she had carried for years without fully realizing it had finally been set down. She kept her promise to Edward's family, drafting a brief, carefully worded document that formally acknowledged the events of the wedding day and the circumstances surrounding her original divorce. A private record meant only to protect her own integrity, should either family ever attempt to rewrite the story in the future. She sent it to Margaret's legal team without fanfare, requesting nothing further in return, and within a week, she received a short, formal letter back, signed by both Edward and Margaret, acknowledging the truth of what had happened between them years earlier, and expressing regret for the way she had been treated. She read the letter once, carefully, sitting alone at her kitchen table on a quiet evening, much like the one when she had first opened the wedding invitation months earlier. She felt no particular triumph reading it, no rush of vindication she might once have expected. She felt only a quiet, settled peace, the sense of a door finally closing gently rather than being slammed shut in anger. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not because she needed to keep proof of what had happened, but because some small part of her wanted a physical reminder of how far she had come from the woman who once believed her worth depended entirely on Edward Calloway's approval. In the weeks that followed, life continued much as it always had. Her firm secured 2 new contracts, both significant enough to require hiring additional staff, and she spent long hours interviewing candidates, building out the kind of team she had once dreamed of leading back when she was answering phones for barely enough money to cover rent. Daniel remained by her side throughout, as steady and dependable as he had been since the earliest days of their partnership, and though neither of them ever spoke about it directly, there existed between them a quiet respect that had only deepened over the years they had spent building something meaningful together. Occasionally, news of Edward and Vanessa reached her through mutual acquaintances or brief mentions in industry circles, updates about the business partnership between their families proceeding smoothly, about Vanessa taking on a more active role within her family's company, about the couple settling into their new life together. Claire found she felt very little when she heard these updates, neither resentment nor lingering sadness, simply a distant, neutral awareness of a life that no longer had any real bearing on her own. She thought, from time to time, about the conversation she had shared with Vanessa near the rose bushes at the edge of the garden, wondering how the young woman's marriage would unfold over the years ahead, hoping sincerely that Edward had learned something from the events of his wedding day, though she understood she had no real control over whether that hope would prove true. She had done what she could, spoken her truth clearly and calmly, and left the rest for others to determine on their own. Months later, on a bright spring morning, Claire stood at the window of her newly expanded office, looking out over the city skyline, reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this particular moment. She thought about the frightened, uncertain woman she had been the day Edward walked out of their marriage, and she thought about the confident, capable woman she had become in the years since, built not through his absence alone, but through her own relentless determination to prove, first to herself and eventually to everyone else, that she was capable of far more than anyone had ever given her credit for. She thought about the invitation that had once seemed like nothing more than a cruel joke, a chance for Edward to relive his triumph over her one final time, and how instead, it had become the moment that finally allowed her to see, with absolute clarity, just how far she had traveled from the woman she used to be. She did not need his wedding to prove her worth. She had already proven it, quietly and steadily, in the years since he left, in every contract she signed, every difficult decision she navigated, every night she refused to give up despite every reason she might have had to quit. She turned away from the window eventually, returning to the stack of papers waiting on her desk, ready to continue building the life she had created entirely on her own terms, free from the shadow of a marriage that had once tried to convince her she was not enough. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she faced them now with a quiet confidence that no one, not even the man who had once tried so hard to diminish her, could ever take away from her again. Claire Bennett had walked into that wedding as a woman many people assumed would arrive small and broken. She had walked out of it, and out of every day that followed, as exactly who she had always been capable of becoming, strong, composed, and entirely unshaken by the cruelty of a man who had once believed he held the power to define her worth. One evening, not long after the letter arrived from Edward's family, Daniel stayed late at the office with her, helping finalize a proposal for one of their newest clients. As they packed up for the night, he asked her, carefully, whether she ever regretted attending the wedding at all, given everything it had stirred up. She thought about the question seriously before answering, turning off her desk lamp and gathering her coat as she considered the months that had passed since that strange, unforgettable day. She told him she did not regret it, not even slightly. She explained that for years after the divorce, some small part of her had carried an unspoken fear that Edward's opinion of her still mattered somehow, that his dismissal of her worth had left behind a quiet wound she had never fully examined. Walking into that wedding, facing him directly, and discovering that his cruelty no longer had any power over her, had given her something she could not have found any other way. It had given her proof, undeniable and complete, that she had truly moved beyond the pain of that chapter in her life, not just in theory, but in practice, standing face to face with the man who caused it. Daniel listened quietly, nodding along as she spoke, understanding better than most people the long, difficult road she had traveled to reach this point. He had been there for the hardest years, the ones filled with uncertainty and exhaustion, and he had watched her transform, slowly and steadily, into the confident, capable woman she was today. He told her, with a small, genuine smile, that he had always believed she would find her way to exactly this moment, even during the darkest days when neither of them had any real evidence to support that belief beyond stubborn hope. They left the office together that evening, walking out into the cool night air, the city lights glowing softly around them. Claire felt a deep sense of gratitude in that moment, not only for the success she had built, but for the people who had stood beside her through the process, people who had believed in her long before she fully believed in herself. In the months that followed, Claire's firm continued to grow, expanding into new markets, and taking on projects that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those early, uncertain years above the bakery. She hired more staff, mentored young professionals who reminded her, in small ways, of the frightened, uncertain woman she had once been, and she made a point of treating each of them with the patience and respect she wished someone had shown her more consistently during her own difficult beginnings. She never spoke publicly about her marriage to Edward, never used the story as a tool for sympathy or attention, choosing instead to let her work speak for itself, exactly as she always had. But privately, in quiet moments, she allowed herself to reflect on how much that single wedding day had clarified for her, how it had forced a confrontation she never sought but ultimately needed, closing a chapter of her life that had remained stubbornly, quietly open for far longer than she had realized. She thought sometimes about Vanessa, hoping the young woman had found happiness in her marriage, hoping Edward had taken to heart even a fraction of what he learned that day, though she understood she would likely never know for certain how their story unfolded beyond the brief updates that occasionally reached her secondhand. She wished them no ill will. She simply hoped, as she moved forward with her own life, that everyone involved had found whatever peace they were searching for, in whatever form it eventually took. As for herself, Claire found her peace not in any single dramatic moment, but in the steady accumulation of ordinary days spent building a life she was genuinely proud of, surrounded by people who valued her exactly as she was, without needing her to shrink or apologize for taking up space in the world. She had walked into that wedding carrying years of quiet pain, and she had walked out of it, and out of every day since, carrying something far more valuable, an unshakable understanding of her own worth, built entirely on her own terms, through her own effort, answering to no one but herself. The story of that wedding day slowly faded into the background of her life, not forgotten, but no longer central to how she understood herself. It became simply one chapter among many, an important one certainly, but only one part of a much larger story that continued to unfold with every new contract signed, every challenge overcome, every quiet evening spent surrounded by people who genuinely valued her presence in their lives. And though she rarely thought about Edward Calloway anymore, when she did, it was without anger, without bitterness, only a quiet, distant recognition that his cruelty had once shaped her in ways she never asked for, but had ultimately failed to define who she became. She had defined that herself, slowly, patiently, one difficult decision at a time, and no wedding invitation, no matter how cruelly intended, had ever been powerful enough to take that away from her. Nearly a year after the wedding, Claire received an unexpected phone call from Nathaniel Hargrove, the investment partner who had approached her so carefully in the corridor outside the study on that strange, unforgettable afternoon. He explained that the estate's board was considering a major expansion, transforming several of their properties into a dedicated network of event and hospitality venues across the region, and he wanted to know whether her firm would be interested in leading the strategic planning for the entire initiative. It was, by far, the largest opportunity her firm had ever been offered, the kind of project that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those early years above the bakery, answering phones for barely enough money to survive. She accepted the offer after careful consideration, recognizing not just the scale of the opportunity but the quiet symmetry of it, the way her life had woven itself, almost impossibly, back to that very estate, the same grounds where she had once stood quietly among wedding guests, watching a marriage unfold that was never meant to include her. This time, however, she was not an invited guest standing on the outskirts of someone else's celebration. She was the architect of something new, something entirely her own, built from years of patience and hard-won expertise. The project consumed much of her time over the following months, requiring frequent visits to properties across the region, long meetings with architects and local planning boards, careful negotiations with investors who wanted assurances that the vision she proposed could be executed successfully. Daniel worked alongside her through every step, and together they built a team capable of managing the scale and complexity of the undertaking, hiring specialists in hospitality design, event logistics, and regional marketing, watching their small consulting firm transform, almost unrecognizably, into a respected name within an entirely new segment of the industry. During one of her site visits to the original estate, now the flagship property in the growing network, Claire found herself walking again through the same gardens where she had once spoken quietly with Vanessa near the rose bushes. The roses had grown fuller since then, the pathways slightly reshaped by recent landscaping work, and she paused for a moment, remembering the strange, complicated day that had brought her here for the first time, and considering how completely different her relationship with this place had become in the time since. She learned, through casual conversation with the estate's staff, that Edward and Vanessa's marriage had settled into a quiet, steady rhythm, neither remarkable nor troubled, simply an ordinary partnership navigating the usual challenges any young couple might face. She felt no particular curiosity about the details, no lingering need to measure her own life against whatever theirs had become. She had long since stopped comparing her worth to anything connected to Edward Calloway, understanding finally, and completely, that her value had never depended on his choices, his approval, or his presence in her life at all. As the expansion project neared its final planning stages, Claire was invited to present the completed vision to the full board of investors, a room full of accomplished business leaders who had, until recently, known her only as a name on a contract rather than the woman behind years of careful, deliberate strategy. She stood at the front of that room, calm and composed exactly as she had been on the day of the wedding, and delivered a presentation that left even the most skeptical board members visibly impressed, securing unanimous approval for the project to move forward. Afterward, as she gathered her materials and prepared to leave the meeting, one of the older board members approached her quietly, complimenting not just the quality of her work but the steady, grounded confidence she carried throughout the presentation. He remarked that it was rare to find someone capable of commanding a room so completely, without ever raising their voice or resorting to theatrics. Claire thanked him graciously, though privately she recognized the truth behind his observation, understanding that the calm confidence he admired had not come easily or quickly. It had been built slowly, over years of hardship and quiet determination, forged in no small part by the very pain she had once believed might destroy her entirely. Driving home that evening, watching the countryside blur past her window in the fading light, Claire allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection on the full arc of her journey, from the frightened, apologetic young woman who once believed her worth depended entirely on being chosen by someone else, to the composed, capable leader now shaping an entire regional business venture through her own vision and effort. She thought about the invitation that had started it all, the cruel intention behind it, and the strange, unexpected gift it had ultimately become, forcing her to finally confront and release the last remaining shadows of a marriage that had ended so long ago. She understood now, with complete clarity, that Edward's attempt to humiliate her had failed not because of some dramatic act of revenge on her part, but simply because she had already become someone he could no longer diminish, someone whose worth had been built too solidly, over too many difficult years, to be shaken by a single afternoon, designed to remind her of pain she had long since moved beyond. As she pulled into the driveway of her home that evening, the porch light glowing warmly against the darkening sky, Claire felt, for perhaps the first time since the divorce, a complete and settled sense of peace, not because every difficulty in her life had disappeared, but because she finally trusted, fully and without doubt, in her own ability to face whatever challenges still lay ahead. She had built a life entirely her own, brick by brick, decision by decision, and no one, not Edward, not his family, not the years of quiet struggle that came before, could ever take that from her again. She stepped out of the car, gathered her belongings, and walked toward her front door, ready for whatever the next chapter of her story might bring, carrying with her not the weight of old pain, but the quiet, unshakable strength of a woman who had learned, through every hard-earned lesson along the way, exactly what she was truly capable of becoming.